Now, the Budget Justice Coalition has been calling for a budget based on human rights. Now, on Wednesday, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana tables the executive's budget proposals in the budget speech. Let's discuss this more with Daniel Mclaren, that's the steering committee member of the Budget Justice Coalition. Daniel, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time this afternoon. You know, I know that everybody on Wednesday will actually be glued to their screens, with many hoping perhaps that the stimulation of the economy will be top priority. What form of stimulation it will take, we don't really know. It remains the big question. But what are you expecting insofar as your call for a budget that is based on human rights?
Yes, thanks, Mfundo. Well, the Budget Justice Coalition wants to see the Minister of Finance stimulate growth, inclusive growth in our economy, as you said, but really also for himself and for the conversation on the budget more broadly, to be much more cognizant of the obligations that our Constitution places on the state, as well as non-state actors, to ensure that there is dignity and equality, and where the human rights of each person in our country are respected and provided for. So we want to see a prosperous South Africa, and this is only possible when the wealth that is produced in our country and the income that's derived from that wealth is distributed much more fairly, and when the state itself is willing and capable of delivering on these obligations to people. So whether it's in terms of providing quality public schools, healthcare services, adequate housing, or transport or municipal services, these are the areas that we want to see prioritized in the Minister's budget statement.
So greater allocation to more of the services, whether we're talking of hospitals, we're talking of education. But you know, there's this big debate. Every time we hear the ministers stating that their budget is essentially pro-poor, but you'd find organizations such as yourselves saying, no, that was not a pro-poor budget. So what should change now? Because your call then will fall on deaf ears, or a minister might come out on Wednesday saying, I actually met the requirements of such an organization.
Yeah, so look, I mean, you really need to look at the budget in three ways. There's the question of how are we financing the budget? So what taxes are we utilizing? What is our situation with public debt? Then there's the question of how we are allocating those resources in the budget. Are we allocating them on the right things, spending them in the right ways? And then how are we actually spending the money? Is there corruption and looting, or are we actually seeing real translation of those allocations into service delivery? So I think the criticism that the Budget Justice Coalition has leveled at the fiscal and budget policies of recent years is that we've taken much too strong an austerity approach, which is basically cutting public services, cutting budgets as the main way to deal with public debt. So we don't say that we don't need to deal with public debt. It's clear to anyone walking the street that you can't borrow forever and see your public debt to GDP increase forever until it consumes everything. Obviously, you can't do that. The question is, how do you balance the budget? And the policy of cutting budgets really places that burden far too squarely on the backs of the majority of poor people, rather than asking those who are still earning good incomes, who are sitting on wealth, who essentially have all of their rights protected, to come in and step up and pay a greater share towards reducing our debt burden so that our public services can be sustained through this difficult period.
Okay, perhaps now what I see here, you're introducing the corporates tax, perhaps. I know that some expect that there'll be a level of restraint insofar as increases in corporates are concerned, and this is purely given on the president's position on the private sector's role in job creation. What is your view? Do you expect corporate tax to in fact be increased in this respect, or there must be that level of restraint?
Well, of course, there was the sort of strange commitment from the outgoing Minister Mboweni that
there would be a reduction.
Income tax would be cut.
Yes,
this year. That's right. But sort of putting an obligation on the incoming finance minister, which isn't what you normally do. We have a new finance minister now. He delivered his inaugural medium-term budget policy statement in October, and traditionally in October, tax proposals are not discussed. So we are expecting to hear a discussion on tax proposals next week. And as a Budget Justice Coalition, we've taken a view that since the 2000s, corporate income tax has been reduced significantly already in our country from about 50% to currently, I think, 32% or 31% was the planned reduction. So we would say that it has been cut enough. That has given enough incentive for business to invest and create jobs. And we now need to be looking at how we actually focus our efforts in our tax system on reforming SARS so that we can effectively tax wealth and high incomes better. We need transparent and effective instruments to redistribute wealth and high incomes at this time, especially when there is low economic growth. And we think that's a fairer and more sustainable way of balancing the budget, because when you completely focus on cutting budgets instead of increasing taxes, you're basically destroying the capability of the state to do anything. We've already seen terrible impacts of state capture and the looting of state resources. And this is the other side of the conversation, which we also want to have about how we make sure that this stops and we spend money more effectively. But if we're just going to respond by cutting budgets, we're going to see health services decline, education services decline, municipal services decline, and that is also going to have an impact on growth, because we need a skilled workforce, we need healthy people. As the COVID-19 pandemic showed, we need a functioning public health system, and we need municipal services to enable businesses to operate and people to work. So we would like to see tax measures rather than budget cuts implemented to balance the budget.
Would I be wrong in possibly thinking that you're of the persuasion that government would have to somehow stimulate demand in a country such as ours if we're looking at the current unemployment rates? Because many are calling for those drastic measures, such as the old economist that said at this point you actually have to hire people to just dig holes and then actually close them up again. Have we reached that crisis level insofar as unemployment is concerned?
Yeah, look, it's really not a question of digging up holes. It's a question of filling potholes, of protecting our environment, of making sure that there's no cable theft. There's so many, making sure there's enough security on the trains, of making sure there's enough health workers in the health system, making sure there's enough teachers in the school system. It's not a question of we just need to employ people. There are significant shortages throughout the state. And the attempts to kind of just push down the public sector wage bill and, this being held up as the kind of solution to all our problems, we just need to spend less on government employees. What has actually resulted from this is kind of this top-down pressure from the National Treasury and from government on the wage bill. You end up with departments who are just basically not filling vacant posts. And so this is basically resulting in skills leaving the public sector.
And in that conversation around the public sector wage bill, it seems some economists actually believe there's no such thing as a bloated wage bill when we speak of South Africa, if we were to compare it to other countries. That in fact, like you say, we've got so many vacancies, particularly in the service space. There are not enough nurses. So where did this narrative start, if many were talking of a bloated wage bill? Or bloated public sector wage?
I think this is exactly the problem which you raised, which is that we haven't been having a specific enough conversation. We just had this kind of ideological conversation with unions on one side and government on the other, government saying we need to cut the wage bill, unions saying we can't cut the wage bill. What we actually need to look at is who are we employing, where are they deployed throughout in the state, and what are the wage structures at the various levels? Because community healthcare workers, for example, there's a need for tens of thousands of those. There's a demonstrated impact they make on healthcare when they're employed. They're not being paid R1 million a year. We're talking much, much lower salaries. So there's a huge scope for the wage bill to increase in certain areas, for example, to employ community health workers. But where are the kind of bloated middle management structures? Where are the benefits packages which have kind of gone too far? And where can savings be made there? So we need to be, I think, specific in what we're talking about. Where is there excess bureaucracy? And I think there's a strong argument, for example, that at national level, we may have too much resources dedicated to personnel at national level compared to local government level, for example. A little bit of a top-heavy government, which is inherited from the past, maybe needs to be we need more employees at the provincial and national level, for example. So let's be specific about how to spend money on government wages, not just try and do this blanket cutting exercise, which isn't really linked to a long-term plan for the future.
Do you expect any policy direction around the retirement fund reform or the proposal for employees to actually receive a third of their retirement fund? Do we expect that from the Finance Minister?
I think, the other question in relation to retirement is whether Regulation 28 and investment in infrastructure by retirement funds. As for, collecting down retirement savings, to be honest with you, this isn't something the Budget Justice Coalition has debated ourselves. So we haven't participated in that specific debate.
And then anything else? Fuel levies, what are your expectations there? Personal income tax, what would you hope?
Again, yeah, look, we have had a reduction in personal income tax over the last 15 years. We've had some slight increases in recent years, and in the last budget, we had basically a small decrease. So, our argument is that those earning over 1 million rand a year in South Africa can afford to pay more tax. I think that's quite clear. And it's those incomes which should be chipping in rather than incomes of the poor through, for example, cuts to social grants. So broadly speaking, Fundo, what we would like to see is the implementation of the basic income grant for those who have no access to income. We think everyone recognizes since the July uprising that we can't delay such measures any longer. And that must be funded through progressive tax reform on higher incomes and wealth, so that we are directly redistributing resources to the poor. This is going to increase the demand that you talked about, and it's a necessary human rights and effective economic strategy, we believe. But it can't come at the cost of funding for other socioeconomic rights, and that's why you need the tax measures to come in there. So we think you can have a long-term strategy which uplifts the poor, balances debt, and creates an inclusive growth if you implement some of the reforms which we've talked about, and using tax side measures rather than simple expenditure cuts as the kind of way forward.
All right. Thank you very much for your insights. That was Daniel Mclaren. He's a member of the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition.